We're now joined by Greg RENOFF, the author of Van Halen Rising and the new Ted Templeman book, A Platinum Producer's Life in Music. How are you, Greg?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, yeah, always excited. Especially the Van Halen story, constantly is a source of, excitement and just, going from the backyard, party and local band into the worldwide icons they were. It's constantly exciting. We live right here in the Burbank, North Hollywood area where we're based. So, even though I was in the Pacific Northwest when Van Halen first came out and helped kind of launch their first records up there in Seattle and Portland and Vancouver, I dreamed of that American dream of a band who literally is playing covers in a bar and becomes the sensation that they are. So tell us a little bit about, you leading up to want to write, Van Halen Rising. What intrigued you so much to want to put that kind of effort and commitment to it?
I grew up a Van Halen fan in New Jersey, and I saw Van Halen on the 1984 tour, and years went by and actually became a historian. I actually was a college professor, and I was looking for kind of a fun, diversionary topic for a little writing project away from my normal academic studies, and I started investigating Van Halen's early days just to see if I could write a short article for Van Halen News Desk or something like that, just for fun. And it ended up talking to some folks who grew up with the Van Halens in Pasadena, and they had some amazing stories. And it was one of those things where they'd say, "You should call this guy," and I talked to this next person, and then they say, "You should talk to this girl," and it just kind of continued, and it snowballed from there. And ended up having more and more material, and realized there was a book here, and actually even more so when I really got to get into the Van Halen story and understand how hard those guys worked to make it for so many years. They joined up with David Lee Roth in 1973 and didn't break out till 78. No overnight success. The whole Gene Simmons saga with him trying to get them a record deal and then being unable to do it. You mentioned here in Burbank, North Hollywood, they gigged in Hollywood for probably 12 to 15 months before they ever got out on the road and did a real tour with Journey and Montrose, and then eventually with Black Sabbath. So, for me, the hard work, and then the parts of the story that were immediately intriguing was the mix of personalities. As we all know, the Van Halen brothers came from Holland in 1962. Musicians didn't speak any English. The family was musicians. They didn't speak any English, and eventually became incredibly skilled at their instruments. They meet this guy across town, David Lee Roth, who's a completely different character than they are, much more outgoing, and they joined forces, even though that maybe it isn't a perfect fit in terms of the personalities, and they take over the world. And so it was a really fun book to write, and it was I think for a lot of Van Halen fans, and for me particularly, is why I wanted to write it. It was because the entire Van Halen beginnings had been kind of shrouded in some sort of, I don't want to say obscurity, but it had never really been properly documented. And I think everyone knew the story of those guys post 1978 and how they made it, but no one really knew about how they ended up going from being, as you mentioned, a backyard party band where they play in everywhere across the city. They were playing in places like everywhere from Anaheim to Orange County up to Altadena. They played all over Greater LA to eventually, of course, becoming a worldwide sensation.
Yeah, I moved here in 1980 again after helping see them, launch, and was right there, when they blew Black Sabbath off the stage, on that first tour. And, coming into this area, the first apartment I got, I went through like a, roommate finder service, and they said, "We got a place in Pasadena," and I'm like, well, I want to be in Hollywood, but I'll take it just for a place until I can find a place in Hollywood. But just being out in that area, just imagining, them not only going to high school there, but just the little bars, and then I started consulting with a band that was rehearsing in like a guest house at one of those mansions in San Marino, and they had all the stories about how Van Halen had played their backyard and set up on the tennis courts, and of course the police show up, and the party's so right as somebody turns over a police car, and it's just growing up in the 70s, it was the ultimate dream. All the big bands, Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Sabbath, they were all British, so you couldn't even imagine where they came from. You're imagining, castles and horses and moats, but this is a real band playing real clubs, going to an American high school. It was obviously revolutionary to the rock business, but it just, to me, it just helped excite all the bands that launched out of Los Angeles, the Motley Crues and Warrants and Dawkins and everybody here. Just imagine, like, well, if a band from Pasadena could do it, there's a chance.
Yep. It's funny you mentioned that house. I think I know exactly what house you're talking about at the Van Shea home. That was the home of one of the biggest parties in 1973 for those guys. It was the helicopter came, the cop car got flipped over, and Jack was the proprietor of the home, was quite the host for rock and roll bands. He had Oingo Boingo play in his backyard later, and yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because it did launch this entire Pasadena rock scene. Armored Saint, all those guys kind of, not necessarily all imitating Van Halen, but sort of felt inspired by, if we can look at Van Halen and they did it, we can get out of Pasadena too, or get out of LA. It's really amazing the effect they have.
Yeah, well, every band that played the Whiskey A Go-Go or Gazaris felt like, hey, Van Halen started here, maybe we got a shot.
Yep, for sure.
That's
for sure. And yeah,
right.
Van Halen went from being that Gazaris cover band, playing almost all, 99% covers in a club like that, to playing all originals at the Whiskey pretty much. And it was, they really earned it. They built a repertoire of originals. They played biker bars. They played all the tunes that people wanted to hear rather than the original songs that they wanted to try to showcase. They really, they really earned it. So that's the other thing that's really cool about it. It was never anything that was handed to those guys, not by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, yeah. I mean, what do you put to the success? Because the first album, even though they led with a cover, You Really Got Me by the Kinks, there's really every original song on that album is a classic. There's no filler on that album. Do you credit the work ethic of the band, having played thousands of shows and really learned those, Zeppelin and Sabbath and Deep Purple, all the hits, and just really knew how to work a crowd and, what would get the, people going, do you credit a lot of that work ethic to the success of that first album?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things I would credit. I mean, I think you're hitting on one of the things I always say is really important, is that when you spend years playing hits, other people's hits and other people's successful songs that are, songs that people love, Zeppelin and Aerosmith, and then all top 40 hits that Van Halen played, you learn how to write songs. I mean, I think it's it's an incredible school for understanding how to build a pop tune, and those guys really figured out how to do that. But the other thing I would say too is I always point to the difference between the Gene Simmons demo, which was done with Gene in New York in 1976, and then what Ted Templeman did with those guys by the first record. I mean, it's kind of night and day, and it's not really a big knock on Gene, because Gene had a short period of time with them and was just trying to get something together for them. But I think Ted was instrumental in really helping those guys hone in on the best parts of their songs, helping them arrange their harmonies, and really thinking about what songs should be showcased on the first record, because it's I think it's pretty much universally praised as a perfect album from front to back. And that was obviously from Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth's writing style and their performances on the record. The whole band was incredible, but Ted and his engineer Don Landy really captured lightning in a bottle. Made it sound so good and made the songs so great. I mean, they're just so incredible, and that was a lot of Ted working with those guys for about 6 months before the record came out, just to sort of do what he did as a producer, to think about how to best showcase the band and the talent in it.
Yeah, well, obviously, Mo Austin and Lenny Waronker and Russ Titelman from Warner Brothers goes to see Van Halen at the legendary Starwood, which is no longer here, Santa Monica and Crescent Heights. And, the rest is history. I mean, obviously, Lenny championed, this was a band, and obviously Ted had the chops from, working with Montrose, with Sammy Hagar and Ronnie Montrose, of course, with Van Morrison and everything that Ted had done. Ted's obviously background making hits with Doobie Brothers and Little Feat and Van Morrison. What do you think it was about the perfect marriage that Warner Brothers and Ted Templeman and Lenny and Mo made the home for a band, like Van Halen to really shine, and of course put Ted on the map to be the hard rock, producer there of the 80s?
I think there's a few things at play there. I mean, I think one of the things that worked in Van Halen's favor was that at that point Ted had a pretty good run of hits. I mean, he had huge hits with the Doobie Brothers. At one point, the Doobies had three albums in the top 200, and in 75 and 76 they were just printing money for Warner Brothers. So Ted had really earned the right to basically point to a band and say, this is the one I want, and I want to sign this band. And Mo Austin was more than happy to go along with Ted's opinion. But the other thing to think about is that Van Halen was a little bit outside of what was, I would say a little bit, quite a bit outside of what was seen as marketable at the time. And Warner Brothers, for all their massive sales success, also was willing to take a chance on artists that maybe seemed like they were a little bit imperfect in terms of the fit of the market. They didn't, in other words, they weren't always chasing the next big thing. And obviously, I'm not trying to necessarily compare Van Halen to Ry Cooder, but I think what I'm trying to say is that Ted had the leeway within the company, and also they had the understanding within the company is that, you can cultivate talent. And that gets to the point that Ted really starts to make in the book, the Ted Templeman biography, that, there weren't a lot of people at Warner Brothers who thought Van Halen was going to be a big hit. In fact, it was mostly just Ted. That's not to say that the other people didn't think the band was talented, the other executives. It was just more that it didn't seem like something that was going to connect with an audience like it did. And so for me, looking at that too, I mean, that's the other thing is that it's, some other labels that might have been more, locked into sort of chasing the latest trend, going, we want to make this year, the year of disco or the year of punk or whatever it would be, might have, maybe pushed back against Ted wanting a band like that. But, because at the time hard rock was not hip at all. In 1977, 78, punk was on the rise, soft rock, disco. I mean, these are the things that were seemingly going to either dominate the market or were dominating the market. So for Ted to take a band like that, seeing the incredible musicianship of Eddie Van Halen, which is really the first thing that really sold Ted on Van Halen. I mean, he liked the whole band, but he would tell you himself that it was the musicianship of Eddie and just the incredible chops and the talent that he saw that night in the Starwood, which is what sold him on wanting to sign the band. To take that and then take it to the top of the charts was quite a story, because as Ted really goes to pains to lay out in the book, he didn't want it to be the repeat of Montrose. That was, you mentioned Montrose. Montrose had basically topped out at about 150 at the charts on the Billboard chart, and it sunk. They never had a single, and that was one of the reasons why Ted encouraged them to do a cover song that he had heard them doing the first night he saw them. In other words, in their repertoire. He didn't suggest it to them. It was in their repertoire, which was really got me, as you alluded to, because he said, I wanted to make sure they had a song that would connect on radio, that it was too important that a hard rock band like this not get overlooked again. I think Ted really was, I know he was really haunted by the Montrose experience. It really bothered him because he felt like Ronnie was a genius and that the songs were so good. I mean, I think everybody today who's a hard rock fan will look at that record and go, it's a classic. I mean, it is an incredible classic that didn't get its due. It didn't sell. I mean, it really didn't sell at all that well in 73, 74. It just, sort of made a minor splash. And so he wanted to make sure these guys really had a chance with a great song. And that was the point with, he really got me to basically stack the deck to make sure that people were going to give it a fair shot and let them break through.
Yeah, no, the Montrose album is certainly considered the blueprint for Van Halen to a lot of people. Every year at the NAMM show, the big music trade show here in Anaheim, they do a big Remembering Ronnie Montrose night, and, a who's who of hard rock musicians come out and play their favorite songs, not only from Montrose, but obviously Ronnie's contributions to Edgar Winter and Van Morrison and all. But the Montrose album, and obviously was the launch for Sammy Hagar. In reading the book here with Ted Templeman, it's interesting that Ted immediately saw David Lee Roth as a possible weak link, in the Van Halen chemistry, and immediately thought Sammy might be a better fit for the band. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so when Ted saw Van Halen, he said I quoted him in the book. He told me, he said it was strange in some way because it was almost like the first time I saw Eddie Van Halen perform live, it was like falling in love with a girl. He said it was just this incredible, this is the guy who's the next great guitar player. He said Ted said he just sort of had like this bolt of lightning when he saw him. He said he really just understood jazz musician, loved bebop, and saw Eddie as the same type of guy who wasn't a conventional, straight-ahead rock guitar player like a lot of guys at the time. And so Ted saw this musicianship that he felt really could be special, and so he did like the whole band. He liked the songs, but when he got Van Halen into the studio to do the demo for the first record, and this would have been about 6 months before they recorded Van Halen 1, Ted said that some of the stuff that Dave was doing was just not acceptable to his ears. Ted didn't spend a lot of time coaching Dave at that point. It was just a matter of just laying the songs down to evaluate, and Ted was concerned. But Ted will go to great pains to tell everybody who will listen that it was something he was mulling over about the idea of Sammy, thinking like, what if Dave really can't do it in the studio? Not saying he can't do it, but what if he couldn't? What would I do? And he was thinking that I could get Sammy. So Ted basically went to work with Van Halen with Dave in the band, and he said that he became to really understand Dave's intellect and his lyrics, and sort of see that when he watched him sing in rehearsal, that there were things that Dave did well, that Dave could be basically coached up in those ways. And so Ted, I think, made a decision. I'm going to stick with this guy. He can do it. It's just like he needs to be coached, and that's really what Ted did was to help Dave, focus on what he did well rather than what he didn't do well, and stop writing, for example, melodies that Dave couldn't sing. I mean, that's something Ted talked about to me quite a bit. He's singers sometimes don't really recognize when they're writing songs what they can pull off or what they can't pull off. They might think they're pulling it off, but when you listen with outside ears, you go that you're not quite capable of doing that. And in Dave's case, that was the case for some of the stuff. So it's just a matter of Ted, who had been a singer himself with Harper's Bazaar and had done all the arrangements with the Doobies, with the background vocals with those guys, and obviously had worked with incredibly gifted singers from Carly Simon to all the way down the line. We could go with people he had worked with in the 70s. He was the right guy to work with Dave to say, okay, we're going to make this work, because you do have things that are distinctive and unusual, the train whistles, screams, and the whole way that Dave approached the vocal performance on Van Halen really was distinctive, and that was something, you give a lot of credit to Dave, but also give credit to Ted to sort of helping Dave kind of work his way through those rough moments.
Well, we got to credit Ted for, pulling it off in the studio, but the way David led the band live, I mean, when they opened for Black Sabbath on the arena tour, and they got out there, I saw them at the California World Music Festival at the LA Coliseum. Of course, they went on right before, I believe it was Aerosmith. I know the second night was Ted Nugent and Cheap Trick, but no one could follow the 1-2 punch of David Lee Roth as the ringleader and Eddie is just the amazing, musician. And so, David was the perfect foil for Eddie to, revolutionize the rock business, especially here in America. It's just amazing that they, had built all that up as MTV was going to become, a new thing in the early 80s. It was just, a match made in heaven, the visuals of the band. It's pretty amazing that they really didn't do, what we think of as music videos back in the days. They'd make a few little visual clips here and there, but, Van Halen is very, very late to the video game.
Yeah, they really didn't get into it until, you're mentioning kind of later in the game, and, by the time 1984 rolled around, that Dave particularly had taken to that format with his partner in crime, Pete Angelos, who later went on to work with Dave with his solo career and actually managed Dave, and then the Black Crowes. But those guys, Pete and Dave, were the ones I think who really, were the ones pushing for the shift to video and making sure that they do more. Whereas someone more like with Alex in the band was much more of the wanted to keep in some ways the Zeppelin tradition alive, where it was a little bit more mystique around the band, where he wasn't so much camera time and stuff like that. It was a little bit different in that way with the brothers, the way they approach things. I mean, they're definitely not as outgoing and as camera seeking as Dave, and who possibly could be, but Dave had the right idea, and Roth. I mean, that's the other thing that Ted really emphasizes in the book, and has emphasized to me, is that Dave had this incredible intellect, and he really had this drive and this vision. I mean, he really was the person. It was more than a vocalist. He was a guy who really had his finger on the pulse of what would make a band successful. And Ted saw that. I mean, Ted saw there was much more than just the guy who just stood in front of a microphone and sang. It was, the whole image, the lyrics, the persona, the sense of humor. I mean, that's the other important point is that, with Montrose, Ted was and Ronnie Montrose both were overtly trying to fuse heavy metal, which would have been called heavy metal at the time, with pop music. They wanted to make, they didn't want to do Sabbath style. They didn't want to do Deep Purple style sort of instrumentals and like longer songs. They wanted to do shorter pop songs that would be catchy but would be incredibly heavy in some ways. And that's what, like you mentioned, the Blueprint. That's what Ted saw with Van Halen, the same type of thing. And he said that they had the harmonies, which made them sound youthful, but they also had Dave, who had this incredible way of looking at the world and just kind of laughing at everything, keeping an upbeat an outlook on life no matter what happened. And so that was really something else that really worked in terms of trying to capture a kind of an optimistic Southern California vibe on their first record, rather than sort of a dirgy, darker, heavy metal thing that some other bands or producers maybe would have done with Van Halen. It just was a different thing, and that's one of the reasons why they were so successful too. They were a band that smiled on stage, and that's Dave. That was Dave, and that was Ed. They kind of looked like they were having a great time up there.
Well, yeah, again, coming off the British artists like Zeppelin and Deep Purple and Sabbath, you couldn't imagine any of those guys smiling. And, Ozzy was in such a, kind of a, darker phase, certainly by the time Van Halen opened for them. It was like night and day. Seeing Van Halen come out with the bright, light, cheery Southern California party vibe, and smiling and just so approachable. And then Deep Purple coming out, with Ozzy just as deep into drugs and alcohol as you could be, just barely able to move on stage. It was like a dirge, coming after a backyard party.
It was, yeah, I mean, it's, you really, if anyone listening, go on YouTube and you can type in Van Halen Fresno. There's some incredible, amazingly, very, very high quality 16 millimeter footage from Van Halen that someone snuck a camera in from Fresno, and you can see it. I mean, just the high energy that Van Halen had on the '78 tour, and just how good they were, and just trying to follow that was just impossible. It was just impossible, and I'm sure Sabbath got Van Halen some nights, but it's been pretty well documented that Van Halen was just an unstoppable force that Sabbath was up against, as those guys were basically breaking up, meaning Sabbath.
Well, yeah, and really thinking outside the box. I mean, at the LA Coliseum, they did the whole stunt where, the helicopter or the parachutist comes out of the plane, and then, Eddie and the guys run on stage, with a parachute behind them, looking like they were the ones that just came out of the plane, and all that type of just high energy, hijinks. Again, anybody could relate to it. Anybody in high school, it's out drinking on a Friday and Saturday night, they want to feel like that could be them on stage. And obviously Ted brought it out in the studio. I mean, we've seen in later years, Ross' voice deteriorating, and people wondering how he was, ever the front man, for that mighty band. But, when you look at it again, his voice wasn't the main, his main attribute. He was the life of the party, and nobody did it better. And like I say, they really blew everybody off the stage as far as being the life of the party. But, talk a little bit more about, this book with Ted, the a platinum producer's life in music. I mean, Ted came from being the musician, growing up in the Bay Area, the whole San Jose, Santa Cruz, Santa Clara area south of San Francisco, and coming up, playing in bands and, getting signed to Warner and being a part of that family. How do you attribute his later success to him, being that musician, songwriter, coming up in the ranks, learning what a hit is, and, learning what the mechanics were from actually being a musician and writer himself?
Yeah, I mean, there's two. It was, first of all, it was a huge honor to be able to write this book with Ted. Number one. Number two, I mean, I think for me, it was just an educational experience to listen to him talk, because he really kind of gave me an insight into what it means to be a record producer, and how a record producer basically goes to work with artists, but also what kind of background that a record producer can bring from its own experience, his own or her own experience, to really help shape records. And for me, sitting with Ted, having him tell me about his youth when he was a jazz prodigy, he was a trumpet player, so he would be the young kid who'd be playing at the Kiwanis Hall with an older piano player and drummer playing jazz. And then Ted learned to play drums and learned piano, came from a musical family. So he had this incredible musical vocabulary as an instrumentalist and also as a performer, even as a kid. And then he goes on, as you mentioned, to go play with Harper's Bazaar. And they had a few, one kind of big hit in 1967 was Feeling Groovy, and then had a number of minor hits after that, sort of easy listening stuff. But what Ted had going for him in terms of that, beyond the basically learning the psychology of being a performer himself, that was really important for him, relating to artists and connecting with everyone from Van Morrison to Michael McDonald to Bette Midler. I mean, he worked with just such an amazing array of artists. The other thing he learned is that he worked with Lenny Waronker, as you already mentioned. Lenny later became president of Warner Brothers, but when Ted first started recording with his band Harper's Bazaar, Lenny was a young, basically untested producer who started producing Harper's Bazaar, and Lenny was the one who came up with the idea of doing Feeling Groovy. And in the months and years that followed, over the next 3 or 4 years, Ted and Lenny became very close friends and remained close friends. And Lenny became Ted's mentor, kind of teaching him about the art of production. The other guys in the band and Harper's Bazaar didn't have as much interest in the studio thing as Ted did. Ted would hang out. He would stay with the engineers. That's how he met Don Landy, actually. He became his right-hand man for years with Van Halen and Doobies and every other big record he made through about the middle 80s. They would spend time together and talk about how do you mic drums, how do you do these things, and Ted was obsessed with that stuff. And in part, the other thing is that Ted sort of realized himself that he was probably not well suited in terms of his personality and maybe in terms of some of his ability to perform basically as a pop star. It wasn't his thing, and he wanted to go to the other side of the glass and become a producer. And that ended up happening by Ted getting an entry-level job with Warner Brothers as a tape listener. So you go from being, a Billboard star to the bottom of the barrel, mailroom type of person, where you go in the room with no windows with the box of tapes and you listen. And a few months after Ted got that job, the Doobie Brothers demo showed up at Warner Brothers. Ted heard it, liked it, showed Lenny. They listened to it together, and they started scouting the Doobies. And eventually, the Doobies get signed, and one of the executives at Warner Brothers, Joe Smith, who was basically Mo Austin's right-hand man at Reprise and Warner Brothers, said, hey, you guys should produce this record. You know about this band. You guys should produce it, and gave Ted a chance. And so in the period that followed, with Ted working with the Doobies and all, Little Feat and Captain Beefheart and just an amazing array of people, he brought to the table not just his experiences as a fledgling, engineer in training and producer in training with Lenny, but he also brought his whole musical training. And I'll give you one quick example of that. Ted grew up really loving Latin jazz, and particularly a lot of the mambos and stuff like that was popular in the 50s, the Cuban jazz. And so if you listen to a lot of the Doobie Brothers records, there's tons of percussion. There's congas, there's timbales, there's all these other instruments. And I was, talking to Ted about this, and he's like, that always go back to me for like Tito Puente and all these people, where Ted grew up playing jazz and loved all that percussion stuff. So if you listen to those records, they almost all have those type of instruments on it. And that's just one example of sort of me learning from Ted. Wow, okay, this wasn't just sort of like one day Ted just woke up and go, in 1975 and go, I should put congas on this. It was more like he had studied these records as a child and as a young man, and sort of understood, okay, here's how a conga can really tie a whole song together. So even listen to Taking It to the Streets. If you listen to it in headphones or listen to it in a good stereo system, you can hear there's a very, very powerful conga part played by Bobby LeKind of the Doobie Brothers all the way through it. And it doesn't, it never really registers on some sort of overt level, but if you listen to it, you realize how important that is to the whole mix of that song to make it successful. So that was the type of stuff that I think Ted drew on from his childhood and his years at Warner Brothers as an artist to become a successful producer.
Well, Sunset Sound, the famed studio right here on Sunset near Crossroads of the World, we drive by it every day, and, the legendary first, few Van Halen albums recorded there, and, of course, Ted and Don Landy, made that magic. Van Halen 1 and 2 and Women and Children First and Fair Warning. What do you credit, that studio and that environment right there in the heart of Hollywood as part of that magic where Ted, really created, their style and their sound, and they stuck with that studio.
He had been in there as a recording artist, and I think right from the jump for Ted with Harper's Bazaar, the very first record he did, so it would have been 1966 and 67, when he was working on this record, he was, it was a kid. Lenny Waronker took them into Sunset Sound, and they actually had a piano player named Leon Russell, who arranged and wrote 3 of the songs on the first record, and Ted sang inside Sunset Sound. But Ted told me in particular he remembered, this was Leon before Leon became the cosmic Leon of the early 70s, who was just such a superstar that it was just a session player at the time, a very talented one. But he heard Leon's piano in Studio One with that great natural reverb in that room and that great room sound, and it really stuck with Ted. They recorded also the vocals in the echo chamber there, and so Ted really got to understand the magic of Sunset Sound. And so as soon as he could start making records as a producer, he brought Little Feat in there, and then Montrose. And in fact, one of the things that was the most, I think, notable about the Montrose record is the great drum sound on Rock Candy, and that was done in Sunset One. The basic the drums were cut there, and all the basic tracks were cut there. And Ted would return there over the years, as you mentioned, with Little Feat. He did some stuff with Carly Simon there, but it was very comfortable for him to work there because he had been there as an artist and kind of had gotten a chance to work in those rooms and hear what worked and didn't work. So it was always like home to him, and it was a place he always wanted to record whenever possible. Later years, it became, for whatever reasons, for geography or whatever, it worked out that they would record in different studios. He recorded in the power station back east, or he, sometimes there would be a conflict and he couldn't get into Sunset Sound, so we recorded Fantasy up in the Bay Area. But he said it was always his first choice was, can we go to Sunset? That was always the first choice.
Yeah, well, it must have been so comfortable for Van Halen, having played on Sunset Strip and up and down that. And, of course, later it became right across the street, the Hollywood Athletic Club, their headquarters with Noel Monk and that whole scene right there. So, obviously, they, very much were a Hollywood band and felt so comfortable there. You see these bands going to the Bahamas and trying to get way out of, their comfort zone. But for Van Halen, Ted Templeman definitely kept them right in their familiar stomping grounds, and there was so much of a live feel, to the Van Halen records that they instantly translated live, to the concert stage.
Yeah, and that's something too that documented quite heavily in the book about that. And Ted gives a lot of credit. This is actually, one of my favorite parts of the book to write with Ted was about his experiences working with Van Morrison. Ted's first record that he worked without another producer in the room. I mean, I guess Van was co-producing, but another quote unquote producer was not actually performing in the band. Was the Van Morrison record? So it was Ted was producing with Van, but Van was obviously in the big room doing his parts. Van was a guy who had no patience for the studio. He wanted to get in and out as fast as possible, and so Ted said, he told me, he said, I'd had these plans when the first few sessions with the band. I had these plans every day. When we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And basically, Van would walk in the morning with Ted, and Ted would basically barely in the control room, and Van would plug in and go 1, 2, 3, 4, and they would start. And the engineers who Ted was working with at the time had been with Van before, and they were already rolling tape. I mean, but that would be, if Ted said if I could convince Van to do something more than once, it was a miracle. It was basically literally almost all first takes. And so unless it was something really like a clunk or something, or had happened, a real clunker where Ted could go to Van this really is, we got to fix this, and could convince him to do it again, it was usually one shot and over. And Ted said that Van wasn't interested in, minutely scrutinizing parts, not at all. So Ted said that he would walk out of those sessions and kind of in shell shock at first, going, this isn't this isn't good, because I'm actually not the guy who's actually being able to sort of not necessarily control things, but basically being able to do what I have planned, which I think is the right approach. But he said, he learned from Van that those first takes and those second takes can be magical. He said, okay, you listen back and there might be a bum bass note, but really, it's it's kind of in the background and no one can really hear it. Or, if it was something where, Van maybe missed a note a little bit, it didn't matter because the vocal itself was so moving and emotional. And he said that was what he learned about recording. He's like, some bands, obviously, you're going to have to do more minute methodical work on a record. For the Doobie Brothers, for example, they had 2 drummers, they had 3 guitar players at one point, a lot of vocalists. You can't just sort of put everyone in the room and slam it out. But for like Van Halen, you could, and that was really what he wanted to always captures that energy, because he's Van Halen great, and that was what made Van Morrison great. It wasn't the Austin did. So yeah, Ted was always interested in getting these records done quickly too, getting them turned around for Van Halen, because he said that was what they were. He said they were so well rehearsed and they were great, and he said by the second or third take, the energy would, like for anybody, might drop a little bit. You just want to get it down on tape. Fix any mistakes later for Van Halen. If there's something you had to overdub or fix, you fix it. But for the most part, they were live takes for the basic tracks on the record, and that's why they're so amazing.
Well, the 70s music era was always my favorite, not only growing up in that era, but, looking back, even youngsters today, walking around with the, Van Halen or AC/DC or Zeppelin or Rolling Stone shirts, I always ask people, what was it about that era that made it so, lasting and so impactful? And a lot of it has to do with what we're talking about, bands that really could cut it, in 1 or 2 takes in the studio, go out there and perform it live with no backing tracks or auto-tune or all the trickery. I mean, by the time, 81, 82 came in, bands were kind of, being created for MTV. There was a whole image thing, if you didn't look good on MTV, they'd bring in different people for the videos to, mime for the pop singers that cut it in the studio. And, obviously this era was very much about real songs, real players, and people that could perform it live. And obviously that's really what established Van Halen as the icons that they were. Funny enough, all those years later, Sammy Hagar becomes the lead singer of Van Halen. That Ted thought might be the choice. In the beginning, and even though Ted didn't produce that 5150 album, what was Ted's thoughts about seeing that come full circle and Sammy becoming the lead singer and having a huge run with Van Halen?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of discussion about that in the book, because that was a very emotional thing for Ted. Ted was someone who adored Van Halen for what it was and what it had, what it had grown into with Dave. That it evolved into this incredibly successful band that always seemed to come up with these incredible tunes. I mean, that's the thing about he understood. Like there were not a lot of bands like Van Halen. There was the Zeppelins, like you mentioned, the Who, these other bands that had this magic to them. And when the split happened, or the split was happening, Ted did everything in his power, according to Ted, to try to keep those guys from splitting up. And when Sammy entered the picture, Ted was not happy about it. It wasn't that he didn't like Sammy. He loved Sammy as a solo artist and a friend, and loved Sammy's upbeat approach to life. I mean, he had nothing but good things to say about Sammy as a person, but he didn't want a different singer in there. And I think, the analogy might be, hey, the Stones are going to get Roger Daltrey, which actually, if anyone remembers, back in the 80s, there were rumors that was going to happen when Mick and Keith were at each other's throats, saying horrible things about each other in the press. I mean, really nasty stuff. Or in the mid-80s when Mick was doing his solo thing, but you could put Roger Daltrey in there, but it's not the Stones, right? And it's no offense to Roger Daltrey. He's an incredible singer, and that's, I think, kind of what Ted was getting at the time, and still says, it's no offense against Sammy, but I only wanted Dave in that band. And so Ted really tried to dissuade the split from what he could do. It obviously wasn't in his control, but he wasn't excited about the dissolution of the original lineup as much as he loved all those guys involved, Sammy, Dave, all those guys, Ed. For him it was like a tragic thing that he had to kind of recognize that it was beyond his or anybody else's control. It was just it was irreconcilable differences, but he was not endorsing the Sammy Hagar replacement. That what it means. I mean, it wasn't up to him to endorse it one way or the other, but he wasn't like, oh great, this is going to be great. He was more like, get Dave back. That was, just guys got to figure it out. Like, get in the room and figure it out, and stop trying to break up, because this is something that we can never ever put back together again. Probably, if it splits, and it's really nasty.
Well, hearing Sammy tell the tale of how he joined Van Halen, being at the, the Ferrari mechanic shop on Van Nuys Boulevard, and Van Nuys, and the Italian owner talking about whose car that was that Sammy liked, and it's Eddie's car, and he says, "Oh, you should sing for his band." I mean, how that came together was so impromptu, but knowing that these worlds were interconnected is so crazy. But obviously, David, wanted more say in the band and wanted to do it himself. So, showed his strength. But ultimately, it's sad to see that Van Halen, without that team, without that core, has really dissipated. And that's why our memories of that 70s, early 80s of Van Halen, the Ted Templeman era, are so strong, in that, like some of these other bands that's, kept it together, our best albums and best memories of Van Halen are the Ted Templeman era and, prior years.
Yeah, it's the other thing that's really interesting about the whole split too, which kind of gets overlooked by me often. I don't always point to it, is that the Don Landy was now basically, because Ted had stepped away from Van Halen. There had been quite a bit of static in the making of the 1984 record, and Ted and Ed had sort of decided, in so many words, to basically, like, Ed was going to was slotted to produce the next Van Halen record. And Don was going to produce it with him. And then, of course, what happens is that Sammy comes on the scene, and Don knew Sammy very well from the Montrose record, because Sammy and Don had worked together on that record as well. So it was this interesting, it was like all the, like all the usual suspects are kind of involved in it. But, I think it worked out, obviously, for Van Halen. It worked out with big record sales, and it was a big boost for Sammy's career, and those guys kept it going for a lot of years. But, I think Ted really went to pains to try to explain that it was something that it just didn't feel right to him putting those things together, even though he could point to Sammy and say the guy's a great singer and I like the guy, and I would always want to produce him as a solo artist, and which he did. He produced VOA for him and had a big hit with him in 1984. But it didn't feel right to Ted, and it felt like something was it just couldn't be Van Halen in his mind, which I get. I mean, it's just, you can't have the Who without Daltrey and Townsend either. You can't just sort of plug some other singer in there and expect it's going to be the Who.
Yeah, no question. Well, we're super excited about the book. I'm reading it now. Platinum Producer's Life in Music. Ted Templeman is told to Greg Renoff. Greg, what do you feel that Ted wants to be known as what his legacy is? What's important now, in these later years, that he wants people to really realize?
I think what Ted probably wants to point to most of all is that he really feels, in all honesty, the fact that he was able to work with such amazing talent. I mean, when I started talking about doing this book with him, he was really adamant about the fact that he didn't want it to be like a personal melodrama of Ted Templeman's, inner and outer life. It was meant to be about the records and the songs. I think when he looks back and thinks about it, he worked with Michael McDonald, Carly Simon, Joan Jett. I mean, there's just an endless number of people he either, was in the studio with or worked with. I think for him, he recognizes that it was just Warner Brothers, and as a vice president there and as a producer there, he had a really privileged position, and that he really, thinks he did great work with those guys. It's something that should be celebrated for the greatness of those talents who recorded those songs and wrote those songs. And that was, for him, you could see it. So, he's in his late 70s, but the man's eyes, he's light up like candles when he talks about the first time he heard Michael McDonald sing in the studio, or when he first heard Van Halen at the Starwood Club, or when he did the Aerosmith record with Done with Mirrors, and Tyler would come up with some great lyrics or something. I mean, he just really is moved by the music and about the great talent that he worked with, and I think that's what he wants to showcase in the book, and that was the goal, was to
Well, that's so important. We always say the music lives on far past the musician and producer's lives, but, so few of them, really read the credits, and that's a shame in the streaming era and even the download era. We used to pore over those album covers, for hours, and look at who produced it and who engineered and what the studio was and who's the manager and, all the guest players on the records. And that's often, lost in today's, computerized manufactured world. And, hopefully more and more of the fans will go back and learn what role that, Ted played in all these records, and, the team with Don and everyone he had together to really make that magic. Because we always say it's like capturing lightning in a bottle, and, it was so rare. Out of all the thousands of records that came out in the 70s, these are some of the records that still get played heavily, every day. And we really appreciate what you've done for Ted with the book. Can't wait. I know we've got to belate the book signing, but what is the website, Greg? Where can they go for more information about the Ted Templeman book and, of course, Van Halen Rising and what you have?
Yeah, so I would say people can definitely follow me on Twitter at Greg Renoff. So it's GREGRENOFF. And that would probably be the best place for people to start. The links are there in the bio, and we can take it from there. I'm going to, as you mentioned, everything because of COVID. Obviously, everybody's life has been turned upside down. There was a, there was a careful marketing plan that was sort of all thrown out the window. Obviously, when we couldn't do live events, and Ted's sequestered out on the West Coast, and I'm in Oklahoma. But we'll figure it out. We're going to get us together eventually once things clear up and get some signed books together. And I'll be signing books, but I know people will want to meet Ted, and that's going to be rescheduled out for Pasadena at Veromans. We'll get that all rescheduled and get it all squared away. But yeah, for the time being, I'd say as I'm sort of recalibrating the book in terms of the events, check me out at Twitter at Greg Renoff. And yeah, I love to chat with people and just really appreciate the time. And of course, the book itself is available for pre-order, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all the different independent booksellers that have websites. You can as a ebook, as a Audible audiobook, and of course as a paperback, and that'll be out April 21st. So it's coming up.
Well, Greg, we appreciate all that you do. Again, Van Halen Rising for all you VH fans, and of course the man behind the knobs, Ted Templeman, a platinum producer's life in music, as told to Greg Renoff. Greg, thank you so much as always. Can't wait to shake your hand at the next signing.
We'll do it. Thank you so much. Appreciate the time.